Elden Ring's legendary weapons are mostly worthy of their title, but Shadow of the Erdtree gave us 4 brand new legendary weapons, capable of changing how certain builds function or being one of the most interesting and complex weapons FromSoft have ever made. These weapons proudly display their legendary status. So I decided to play through Elden Ring and the entire DLC 4 separate times, once with each of the DLC legendary weapons to truly work out which one is the best. Let's start off with the structure of the runs. I'd start by giving myself the weapon, the minimum requirements to use the weapon, then in this order, killed Margit, Godric, Radahn, Draconic Tree Sentinel, Godfrey, Morgott, Fire Giant, Mog. Then at Shadow Tree Blessing level 12, I killed all 11 main DLC bosses, headed back to main game to defeat the Godskins, Malekith, Gideon, Godfrey, and finally Radagast. Throughout each run, I would get upgrade materials, talismans, physic tiers, and buffs, including the Golden Vow incantation and Howler Shiburi on all weapons except the Ancient Meteor or Greatsword, where I use Flame Grant Me Strength due to the weapon's lack of faith scaling. Quickly before we jump into the list, I'm happy to present the next merch drop in collaboration with Project Orochi, this time centered around Mogwin's Sacred Spear. I love this weapon to pieces, so to have this amazing design and some merch for you guys is awesome. It comes in 3 colors on tees and hoodies, and Project Orochi is running a Black Friday sale from noon till midnight today. These usually sell out fast, so head on over to projectorochi.com to get in early. And if you're watching after Black Friday, fear not. You can still get 10% off your order using the code SNUPPET. So go get yourself some sweet merch. But now, let's jump into the list. Coming in 4th, the Sword of Light. A very holy and very bright straight sword. Found by first collecting the Stone Sheath Sword from any 3 of the altars, then taking it to another altar. But because of some strangeness with the altars, I recommend collecting the Stone Sheath Sword at the Ruins of Onte and transforming it into the Sword of Light at the Ruins of Ra altar. With a 50-50 split between physical and holy, and scaling strongest of strength, the melee part of this weapon is only partially holy, with the faith scaling significantly less, but the base holy damage is the highest of any straight sword. Its moveset is nothing special, but it does have the great poking attack after a roll or crouch, allowing you to quickly punish bosses in the middle of a combo. The weapon itself is fairly basic, but its skill is much more exciting. Light. Creating a bunch of very bright light beams in front of you, dealing only holy damage, scaling entirely off faith, and it can hit up to 5 times and deals 5 stance damage each hit. This skill is visually stunning, but once you start using it, you begin to notice its significant drawbacks. The first and biggest in my opinion is the time it takes to cast. There was only a couple of instances during a fight where I could get this skill off, and every other time was when the boss staggered from the skill or was already staggered. And even then, I still couldn't get the riposte off since the skill is just that long. This long casting time also meant that if you were to get staggered mid-cast, which happened very often, you would only get half the attack off and therefore half the damage and stance damage. Next thing is the actual damage is quite low. Even with buffs such as the Ritual Sword, Sacred Scorpion, Warrior Jarshard, Holy Tier, and 80 Faith, even on the Holy weak enemies such as Mesmer, I was looking at 5,500 at most. And I don't even want to talk about the Holy resistant enemies. But this skill does have an upside, or a downside depending on who you are. When it's casted, it boosts all holy damage by 20% for 60 seconds, which for people using holy incantations or the 2 pure holy weapons, it's great. But for everything else, it's pretty much a nerf, including the weapon itself, because this is a body buff. So if you have Flame Grant Me Strength activated, because the weapon is more physical damage, it will start doing less damage. If you have Iron Jar, Blood Boil, any consumable or spell defense buff active, it deactivates those. And if you have the biggest buff, Howler Shiburi activated, the weapon's melee attacks will deal 15% less damage after the skill. So here's my advice. If you're doing a holy incantation build, use this sword. It's great. But for anything else, go pick up its brother. Trust me, it's way better. Oh, look at that. It's the brother we were just talking about. In third place, the Sword of Darkness. A very holy and very dark straight sword. My suggestion for obtaining this weapon is to take the previously acquired Stone Sheath Sword or the Sword of Light to the Fog Rift altar to transform them into the Sword of Darkness. Now, the weapon itself is the exact same as the Sword of Light, except for the model it uses and its skill. So let's just skip to the fun part, Darkness. It creates a spiral of dark projectiles all the way around you that, once again, deal exclusively holy damage and 20 stance damage. And even though it does overlap itself, you can't hit twice as it shares the same hit list, meaning once a single projectile hits an enemy, it pretty much deactivates all the other projectiles. But it can still hit multiple enemies in one cast, so crowd clearing is incredibly easy thanks to that 360-degree hitbox. Unfortunately, it does have the same long cast as the Sword of Light, but since it hits only once, it means that even if you get staggered, the full entire hit still goes off, which, might I say, is a monstrous hit. I was constantly shocked by how hard this hits some of the Holy Weak enemies, pulling nearly 10,000 on Gaius and the Putrescent Knight, but that pure holy damage does mean it still struggles on bosses such as Radagon. An upside to using this skill though is it makes itself stronger, since the skill makes enemies take 20% more holy damage for 60 seconds, and since it's not an aura or body buff, you can still keep buffs such as Hal Shibiri to make it fly. Unlike the Sword of Light, which activates instantly, the damage does take a second to go off on this skill, but then it knocks down humanoid enemies, so NPCs can be pretty much stun locked. So from its far higher damage, single hitbox, debuff, and even its knockdown ability, the Sword of Darkness lands itself in third place. With a silver medal, the Ancient Meteoric or Greatsword, a colossal sword with probably one of the longest names in the game. Found as a reward at the end of the Ruined Forge of Starfall Past, its damage is split about 85 to 15 between physical and magic. The physical scales strongly off strength, but thanks to its arcane scaling, even though it is lower, it increases both the magic and physical damage, making it one of the strongest colossal swords in the game. This weapon uses the great moveset found on the Zweihander, so its rolling, crouching attack and the R2 is a poke, which works nicely alongside its pierce damage, allowing counterattacks to happen quite often thanks to its fast and long-reaching hitbox. But the skill, as always, is where it gets crazy. White Light Charge. Split into two separate inputs, the first lunging you incredibly far forward with a second follow-up explosion. It deals the same damage split as the weapon itself, making Flame Grant Me Strength still very strong, and it deals 12 stance damage on the first hit and 24 on the second, allowing you to easily stance break enemies with this skill. The damage itself is also absolutely insane, and the lunge also allowed me to punish enemies incredibly easy by closing the distance between me and the enemy, such as on Radagon's fight. And you can even use this lunge to dodge enemy attacks because of how quick it is. The recovery on the first part is also very quick, allowing you to simply follow it up with a standard attack, which for this weapon I use the Ritual Sword, Axe Talisman, Two-Handed Sword Talisman, and the Spike Crack tier to make my charge attacks beyond powerful. And if all that doesn't already sound good enough, the first hit of the skill can slightly stack into humanoid enemies, then the explosion can completely knock them down, making it easy to script NPC fights, but do be cautious on bosses like Melania. And coming in first place, Euphoria, an extremely holy twin blade with one of the coolest weapon mechanics FromSoft have ever made. Now, this weapon is unfortunately found down a treacherous path in a Nero limb, so it's an extremely late game weapon. But there is a relatively easy skip you can do in Ballarat to get this weapon right at the beginning of the DLC, so you pick your poison. It's a 45 to 55 damage split between physical and holy, with the holy damage scaling strongly off faith, and the strength and dex falling quite far behind scaling the physical damage, which you will have a better time leveling strength thanks to the two-handed strength benefit. Even though this weapon is heavily holy based, the damage output is insane on every boss, but you probably noticed that the weapon is glowing, and that's its luster. It's a 2-stage buff that applies to the weapon when attacking, adding 95 and 120 holy damage respectively. It takes 5 hits to build up each stage, so an entire R1 combo or 2 full charge attacks will completely charge the weapon, and the buff will last 40 seconds before transitioning to stage 1, where it will last another 25 seconds before disappearing. With it activated, the damage went from already insane to completely over the top. On holy weak enemies, charge attacks could easily pull thousands of damage, and even on the strongest holy based enemies, this weapon still pulled its weight heavily. But the luster doesn't only change the melee aspect of the weapon, but also one of the most insane skills in the entire game, Euphoria Vortex. With no luster, this skill will spin the weapon in front of you, hitting 5 times and still dealing a substantial amount of damage. But with either stage of luster, the skill also shoots out a light beam, dealing exclusively holy damage. With stage 1 luster, it hits 9 times and deals 15 stance damage. But with stage 2 luster, the skill cast is much longer, hitting up to 15 times and dealing a massive 47.2 stance damage. So I could use the beginning of the skill to stagger an enemy to safely get the attack off. The damage from this is capable of killing bosses instantaneously, even pulling over 3,000 damage on Malekith, who is 80% resistant to holy damage, or a cool 30,000 on Romina. If that somehow doesn't sound good enough, the weapon itself can also hit alongside the beam of light, roughly increasing stage 1's damage by 20% and stance by 40%, and stage 2's damage and stance by 30%. You can also move yourself around when casting this skill, redirect the attack, or even roll out of the stage 2 cast if it is lasting too long, but most things would already be dead by that point. You can also use enemies before boss fights to build the luster on a weapon, so you are constantly doing the most damage during the fight. Now, because of the weapon's melee and skill being so strong, you can actually create 2 builds with this. The first is to focus on the melee, using Ritual Sword, Two-Handed Sword Talisman, Axe Talisman, and any of the consecutive talismans with the consecutive and charge tier in the physic. And the second is to focus the skill, using Ritual Sword, either Jar Shard, Sacred Scorpion, and any consecutive attack talisman alongside the Holy Shroud and Crack tier and consecutive tier in the physic, though the consecutive attacks will only trigger if the weapon itself hits during the skill cast. For my run, I use the Ritual Sword, Warrior Jar Shard, Sacred Scorpion, and Two-Handed Sword Talisman alongside the Charge tier and Holy tier in the physic to get the best of both worlds. If there is any weapon deserving of its legendary title, it's this one. So I give you not only the best DLC legendary weapon, but one of the best weapons FromSoft have ever made, the Euphoria. What the fuck? Oh! Goodbye. Holy fuck! Oh my god! Oh yeah. And there's my ranking for the best DLC legendary weapon. Placing them against the base game weapons, Euphoria lives at the top. But similar to the Remembrance weapons, the top 3 are very interchangeable. The Ancient Mudrik or Greatsword becomes the best legendary Colossal Sword because its damage output is simply much higher than the other swords. the Sword of Night and Flame did receive Rellana's cameo, so that still sits above it. The Sword of Light and Darkness both sit just below the Bolt of Grand Stacks because the skill is simply too slow, but their ability to be used with other builds is massive points in my book. And the holy weaknesses found across the DLC will move the Golden Order Greatsword up a spot. Up next is Dark Souls 2, and with 43 weapons, don't expect that anytime soon. Do subscribe so you don't miss out on that. But for now, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Go get yourself some sweet ass merch, and I'll see you all later.